So I've been obsessed with the idea of decades for basically my entire life. And over the years, I've seen tons of people online especially saying that like decades don't have an aesthetic anymore. I've seen old posts saying this about the 2000s, which is crazy in retrospect, but this whole sentiment really seemed like it took off in the early 2010s. And in this now time-honored tradition, I see people saying the 2020s also lack an aesthetic. A lot of people also seem to have this idea that everything after 2010 just kind of like blends together. The 2010s and the 2020s both have extremely distinct identities as decades. And I think that they can be divided up into about 3 or 4 eras that each have their own mood and vibe and aesthetic and everything. There's the early 2010s, the late 2010s, the 2020s, and then the optional era that I don't really know where to categorize as COVID, because like COVID kind of collapsed time and like it's just hard to pin down whether it's 2020s or whether it's 2010s, like, because it is kind of just both. These eras all have extremely distinct fashion, music, politics, technology, media, and once you see how different they are, the whole idea of decades not having an aesthetic anymore looks ridiculous. This video is going to be video 1 of a series where I go over like the identities of these eras, and this one is going to be the one about the early 2010s, which I'm very excited for. I'm excited for all of them, but I'm very excited for this one. But before we can jump into the cotton candy optimism of the early 2010s, we have to go over some basic decadology. Decadology is a pseudoscience. It's part evidence, part just like vibes. Honestly, that's because the whole construct of a decade isn't even real in the way that people talk about it. It's a social construct. Technically, the word decade means like a span of 10 years, like duh. But that's obviously not how culture actually works. It doesn't start in year 1 and end in year 10. It's fluid. You can see that with the decades of the 20th century, the ones that people widely agree do have an aesthetic. Like the early 80s looks completely different from the late 80s. There are also always people who are out of touch with the style of a decade. Life is chaotic, people don't move as a monolith, people do their own thing. Take your parents' house as an example. Depending on the last time they renovated or how old they are, your parents' house might look like the 90s or the 2000s or even the 2010s, even though those decades are all over. Decades also always tend to take inspiration from the past. The 80s did the 50s, and the 70s did the Renaissance. I don't know, 70s were weird as fuck. People like to say that decades run on a clean cycle, like, oh, they just repeat whatever was popular 20 years ago because of nostalgia and whatever. And it's like, okay, yeah, there's like a little bit of truth to that. There is some kind of cycle there, but it's not that clean. Decades can take inspiration from whenever they want. Again, like the 70s doing the Renaissance. Like, they totally had a medieval thing going on in the 70s. That wasn't 20 years ago. And also, to even just be able to conceptualize the idea of like the aesthetic of a decade, what a decade is supposed to look like, you have to flatten history an unbelievable amount. You have to just compress everything so much because it's a whole decade. But the most important thing to know about decadology is that decades are always structural first and aesthetic second. The style of a decade reflects the state of the economy, the media people had access to, the politics of the time, and the overall mood, like what people think about society right now and what it's going to be like in the future. People are masters of projection. Whatever people feel about the world, their anxieties, their fears, their hopes, are going to get projected onto the fashion at any given time, to some extent anyways. Obviously it's not a perfect like causal thing, but it does happen. People do project their feelings onto the stuff that they wear and buy and do and whatever. People also like to act as if the internet has like killed decades, but it really hasn't. It's just changed how they form. Like in the past, you could identify a decade based off of what was monoculturally popular. Like, for example, the 90s had Friends. Everybody knew Friends. But of course there's no Friends in the 2020s. Like, who even watches TV anymore? It's the friggin' 2020s. The rise of the internet and algorithms and everything in the 2010s changed the shape of how decades form, but it didn't like make them extinct. And with that, let's put on our horrible neon clothes, comb out our side part, and take a journey back in time to the early 2010s. So it might be controversial for me to say that the early 2010s actually started in 2008. But that goes back to the whole thing about decades not being neat and tidy. It doesn't start in the 0 and end in the 9. When you look at what was going on at the time, you can see the early 2010s taking shape around 2008, with a few different events. The 2008 financial crisis, the election of Barack Obama, the introduction of the iPhone in 2007, but like close enough, and the rise of early right-wing populist movements like the Tea Party. All these things came together and helped create the aesthetic of the early 2010s. And I mean that literally. Like, the look is downstream from the situation. I don't know how much I'm gonna probably say that a lot. We'll get deeper into all this, but keep those 4 things in your head while I paint the scene. When you boil it down to the absolute possible basics, early 2010s fashion was somewhere in the lineage of like 80s athletic wear. Like, I'm talking with the tight fit and the spandex and like the neon colors. But it was filtered through like the internet and irony and a more like modern lens. And obviously it wasn't all athletic wear. That's not a perfect example, but that's the best kind of callback I can make to an earlier decade that I think might have inspired early 2010s fashion a little bit. People in the early 2010s loved skinny jeans. They would not wear any normal pants. Now, in the Big 2-5, or the Big 2-6, millennials widely have a reputation for loving skinny jeans. Well, that comes from the early 2010s, when the millennials were in their prime. On top of things like jeggings and skinny jeans, there's like a whole array of fashion trends that were big in the early 2010s that I'm just gonna list off. Something that was really popular at the time were like graphic tees that were usually in an atrociously bright neon color and usually had something kind of dorky on it, like a mustache or like a slogan like "Eat Sleep Game" or like a cassette tape or like a taco or like Galaxy Cat or something. I don't fucking know. Think of like Dez from Austin and Alley. They loved bright colors, neons, like that green, purple, blue, pink, purple, like those kind of colors, orange. I think they were trying to look like futuristic, but it wound up just looking like friggin' grade 7. So they made insane pattern choices and insane layering choices. They would do like zebra print top with my leopard print like overcoat and my and my chevron pants and my like hang some like chains off of it and shit. It was just like they were doing too much. Like look at CC and Rocky here. Oh yeah, and Galaxy Print. Can't forget Galaxy Print. They loved like chunky accessories, which I also think goes back to the whole 80s things. Like they do like a great big huge necklace or like a big chunky plastic bracelet that's like turquoise, or like they do a bunch of those. Remember those little like silly bands or whatever, like the animal ones? Like they do like a million of those and then just put them all down their whole arm. And how could I forget side parts? Side parts were everywhere. Everyone had a side part. I had a side part. I had a faux hawk too. And then there's the worst, the most utterly disgusting trend that there was. And I'm sorry if you like them, but I hate the friggin' skinny glasses. They were more of a 2000s holdover that just kind of survived into the early 2010s before finally being killed off around the end at like 2015 or 16. I hated them so much. I had a pair of those too. I literally, there's pictures of me as a kid in my like checkered flannel shirt, which was also another early 2010s fashion trend, with my faux hawk and my skinny glasses on, and I'm just like, oh my god. All of these fashion trends were really doing like too much, but they come together to make something that is very distinctly the early 2010s. Now, the music. Early 2010s pop music was obsessed with sounding like shiny. We were in our party era. They loved like buzzy, loud synthesizers and digital effects with huge choruses with like big leads and tons of auto-tune. The whole vibe was basically just like cotton candy EDM party. It was not deep, and it was definitely not subtle. A big early 2010s trend in music was pop songs that had rap sections like towards the back. I don't really know the structure of music, but like a lot of these rap sections, because they had to be clean for the radio, they're so dorky looking back, they're so funny, I love them so much. Fun fact, in the early 2010s, pop songs were about like a minute, maybe 30 seconds longer on average than they are now, which says something about our attention spans. The early 2010s was also the last time that most pop songs had bridges. Yeah, that was the last time that bridges were like a big deal in songs. We don't really do bridges anymore, which is interesting. Well, oh, oh. Well, oh, 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 oh. That was the vocal expulsion, widely known as the millennial whoop, and it was also popular in early 2010s pop music. If you go back and listen to songs from that era, literally every single one has got a oh. In the description of this video, there should be a link to my early 2010s playlist. It's called Digital Boom, and I think it represents the era like pretty well if you want to take a look. If you don't, then like, okay. This whole like party, like let's not think, let's wave our hands, vibe was not just the music. It was the attitude of the time. A lot of early 2010s culture was basically just like, let's go out, guys, everything's fine, which is a very oddly specific thing to be saying all the time right after a global financial crisis. Speaking of which, since the 1980s, the dominant ideology in the United States has been something called neoliberalism, which isn't tied to liberals in the political sense, as much as it is tied to conservatives. It's an inherently conservative ideology that was started by our old pal on this channel, you might know him, Ronald Reagan. I think I'm going to mention him in every single video I do. To simplify, and for the sake of this video, we're just going to say that neoliberalism is basically the idea that the government should have a smaller role in the economy. They should cut taxes and slash regulations to allow companies to have more freedom to make more money. This was sold to American voters by the Reagan administration as trickle-down economics, which is basically the idea that if rich people make more money, we all make more money, which is like obviously ridiculous in retrospect. But in the 80s, people ate that shit up and they voted for him, so we got him as the president. This ideology got a huge foothold in both the Republican Party and with the Democrats, so both parties were doing this. The spread of neoliberalism resulted in Congress in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, repealing all sorts of laws that kept companies from engaging in shady or dangerous business dealings. For example, in the 1990s, under Bill Clinton, again because Democrats are also neoliberals, Congress repealed a bunch of regulations around mortgages and lending. This led to a whole new market for like predatory lending and predatory loans and predatory mortgages that were made so that people would take on more than they could actually afford. And they were often targeted at minorities and the working class, because of course they were. Then, shock face emoji, this all backfired. Who could have seen that coming? Oh my god. Me when I repeal all the rules and then let the companies do whatever they want and they fuck up? Huh. Wow. People started defaulting on all their predatory mortgages, and eventually this whole thing snowballed and turned into the 2008 financial crisis. Obviously this is simplified, everything in this video will be, again, I'm covering a whole decade. But the financial crisis matters a lot for the aesthetic of the early 2010s, because the aesthetic and the optimism were kind of an attempt to cover up the cracks that were forming at the surface of the economy and our whole world. People in the early 2010s wanted change after the financial crisis. They were very upset with the establishment government, and nobody represented this desire for change better than one Barack Obama. You may have heard of him. During the financial crisis, most Americans were very tired of the incompetence and the constant scandal of the Bush administration. Sound familiar? Bush did the Iraq War, he aided and abetted the financial crisis, he was mired in scandal, he was very clearly kind of dumb, and because of this, Americans elected outsider candidate Barack Obama. As the first black president, a very charismatic public speaker, and a seemingly competent politician, Barack Obama made waves across the United States and won the election pretty easily in 2008. He just represented a huge shift in the mood towards optimism and social progress. And as president, Obama presided over the cleanup of the 2008 financial crisis. He did actually do some good things and did actually help the country to an extent. Under his administration, regulations tightened, policies changed, and the economy eventually stabilized and then recovered from the financial crisis after a few years. But it's important to note that Obama was not really the outsider that he presented himself as, or the outsider that Americans very obviously wanted. He was basically just another neoliberal wearing a socially progressive skin suit. He was backed by a lot of the same organizations and donors that regular Democratic and Republican politicians are backed by, and his ideas, while being very socially progressive, and some being kind of economically progressive, like the Affordable Care Act, he really didn't do anything that would challenge actual power or the status quo, economically speaking. For example, in his response to the 2008 crisis, sure, he did help end the crisis, but he did so through giant bailouts of billions and billions of dollars that went directly to corporations. Meanwhile, the American people, like regular everyday people who had also had a horrible time in the crisis and had no responsibility in causing it, got nothing. Zip. No help at all, even though 1 in 10 of them were unemployed, and a quarter of them lost almost all of their net worth. This response to the 2008 financial crisis was a huge deal and was never forgotten, because all it did was continue to sour the neoliberal brand and make people hate establishment politicians even more than they already did. Because not only did they cause this crisis, but all they did was help corporations once it actually happened. You couldn't send a clearer message that I don't give a fuck about you, you know? Like, but again, the Democrats in the early 2010s went into a very socially progressive direction where they did things. They legalized gay marriage, they helped normalize tons of more progressive things in society. They did some real social good. They just really did not do a good job economically because they're a bunch of corporate Democrats. What do you expect? And this again is where the whole early 2010s aesthetic comes in. You get this glossy hope and optimism on top of an economic reality that just really doesn't match. You know what I mean? Like, Obama meant hope and change in vibes only. He didn't really change anything. Economically, anyways. Of course, he did do stuff, but, like, not enough. Something very important was happening in the early 2010s. And that was smartphones and just digital technology in general going mainstream. Technology was new, it was novel, it was something to be hopeful about. It could change the way that we do things, connect people, and that was how it was sold to the public by, large corporations and the media. But I really think that's how a lot of people wanted to think about technology, to just cope with life in the world. We have something in the future that's going to spread democracy, and it's going to help people do their work and get together and stuff. Social media seemed fun and like a toy. This excitement was reflected in a very early 2010s phenomenon, which was people lining up for days outside the Apple Store every time a new iPhone dropped. Look at this iPhone 4. This was one of the ones that people were lining up around the block to get. White was the color for tech in the early 2010s. It represented the future. It was clean. It was sleek. It's almost like one of those idealized pictures of like the eco-future where all the buildings are white and everything's covered in plants. It's utopian. The future's here and it's in your hand. And you can text on it and play like Flappy Bird or whatever. People make the argument that like, oh, we've had iPhones since 2010, so therefore it's all just one big blob and there's no distinct decade aesthetic. But then it's like, once you look at this old phone and compare it to your phone right now, you'll notice that this camera is about the size of your flashlight, and your cameras are like the size of the back of the entire phone. Like, phones now are imposing, they're big, they've got huge cameras, they feel authoritarian. This one almost seems like it doesn't know what it's supposed to be yet. We have edge-to-edge screen now. They're still doing buttons. Like, it's very clearly a different vibe of technology. Like, it's not the same at all. This optimism about technology in the future seems low-key, like, insane to us in 2025. But it makes sense when you put it in the context of the era. That phone wasn't spying on you. 3G couldn't even stream video. It was a device to receive texts and calls and browse the web or play little arcade-style games, and that was really it. Tech companies, which we now think of as these imposing monopolies with authoritarian desires who want to like create AI god and control the world, didn't have that reputation yet. People in the early 2010s widely saw tech companies as like plucky little startups where the employees would just play ping pong and like think up quirky new features all day. And again, the media and corporate messaging helped create that image. Obviously, it wasn't completely organic, but people did want to think that. Specifically, tech-based media, like tech magazines like Wired and stuff, covered things completely uncritically. They acted as if new technology could only be good. But also, to be fair to people, it wasn't clear the direction that this was going to take at the time. Like, nobody knew that by 2025 we'd have like billionaires trying to infiltrate the government and stuff like that. They just thought these were like nerds, basically. Algorithms are going to play a huge role in the next video about the late 2010s, but in the early 2010s, algorithms were still in their infancy. But through the early 2010s, platforms were rolling out small algorithmic features, like the news feed on Facebook or like YouTube improving the suggested videos. They were small improvements, and the algorithms weren't driving the whole experience. They were just helping you, they were suggesting things. The mindset about technology at the time was literally just novelty. It was like, look at this cool new thing I got on my phone. That was how people engaged with technology. They didn't think about the downsides or the creepiness or just all the information that they were giving away. Most of the apps on the App Store were just like simple arcade games that cost 99 cents one time, which is something we need to bring back. Apps literally used to be 99 cents and you would pay once and then you would get it forever, and it was yours to keep, and there were no ads, no nothing. Fucking amazing. Hill Climb Racing, Flappy Bird, Jetpack Joy Ride, iBeer. Only the real ones remember iBeer. All the apps were literally just like single-player arcade-style games, which I think is so quaint. Looking back, I love it. But not everybody was super excited about the internet. For example, legacy institutions and the mainstream media tended to scoff at the internet and at creators and think that they were unserious and could never surpass us. Which, like, I don't know, that didn't age very well, did it, CBS? When's the last time you watched friggin' CBS? But in the early 2010s, legacy media did have most of the clout. If you wanted to be famous from the internet, you had to go on the Ellen Show. Every single like meme person or person that went viral online went on the friggin' Ellen Show. Ellen loved just picking content off the internet and then using it to make her shitty show. If you haven't deduced this already, the early 2010s were a time of rapid societal change. Literally everything was changing. But the older, more conservative crowd hated the changes that were happening in the early 2010s. They hated the new technology, they hated the social progress, and they hated the whole vibe. They hated the music, they hated the fashion, they hated everything. They thought the world was getting too modern and too complicated, and they were not happy about it. The Tea Party movement was a watershed event in the early 2010s. It set the stage for Trump and the MAGA movement that came later. It was a protest movement on the Republican side that helped the Republicans win the 2010 midterms. The movement identified as fiscally conservative and socially annoying. They advocated for things like reducing the national debt, which is a noble goal, I'll give them that, but also for lower taxes and decreased government spending. What does this sound like to you? Neoliberalism! Yup, this movement was just another branch of neoliberalism, just this time it was more grievance-based and populist, and dressed in friggin' pantaloons, I guess. As we've established on this channel a million times, cutting government services is almost always bad news and is almost always bad for regular middle class and working class people. Most of the people in the Tea Party movement weren't ideological so much as they were just undereducated and fucking pissed. They weren't thinking about the consequences that tax cuts might have on the working class and what it might do to government services. Because obviously, like, they weren't connecting all them dots. Their thought process was something more along the lines of, like, the government's screwing up my life, let's get rid of it. And that kind of sentiment amongst normal working class people was very useful to people like the Koch brothers. They organized and funded a lot of what the Tea Party did. Not all of it, but a lot of the political actions and like the protests and stuff that the movement took were organized by the Koch brothers. A whole slew of other corporate interests were also found to be involved in the funding and organizing of the Tea Party movement, which included groups linked to the tobacco industry, Because, of course, Al Gore actually linked the ideology of the Tea Party movement back to Lewis Powell's memo in the 1970s, which was basically a memo that was written and addressed to, like, the Chamber of Commerce, like, business people, conservative business people, and it just told them to start sinking as much money as they possibly can into think tanks and other conservative organizations to try and build up a pro-corporate conservative political movement in the United States. And I thought that was so funny that Al Gore said that, because I talked about that memo in my last video on the conservative media ecosystem, and I just think it's funny to see it making another appearance. Apparently this Powell guy was pretty fucking important, so everything bad always goes back to the Powell memo, Reagan, and the fucking tobacco industry. It's them, it's the trifecta. It's the Son, the Spirit, and the Holy Ghost of being a shitty person. Anyways, the Tea Party movement was organizationally and financially sketchy as fuck, but it was tapping into something real. The rage that people felt against the system and the establishment in politics. This is the same anger that Trump later exploited in his 2015-16 campaign and then grew into the disaster that we know today. And this is where the early 2010s aesthetic really starts to feel darker, because as much as there's the glossy Apple futurism and the neon shirts and the like cat memes and Nyan Cat and troll face and whatever, the cracks were forming underneath, and the world that we live in today and all of its problems were already forming. By the end of the early 2010s, around 2015-2016, the Tea Party was declared dead, and it was replaced by MAGA. But the Tea Party really did set the foundation. They normalized grievance politics in the Republican Party. They normalized the idea of blind outrage driving political discourse instead of, like, policy. You know what I mean? The Tea Party movement came in at the perfect time with the rise of the conservative media ecosystem, the rise of the internet, the financial crisis, backlash to social progressivism, and it curdled into something horrible. It was just a slew of factors that all came together to create Donald Trump and the Republican Party that we know today. It wasn't destiny. Trump is the structural outcome of all this stuff. Like, it's just so, like, of course he came out of this, you know what I mean? The United States' slow slide into authoritarianism that had been going on since the 1980s sped up rapidly in the early 2010s, and the Tea Party is part of the reason why. It's just interesting to think about, because all the stuff that we're dealing with right now has been going on for our whole lives, and we just didn't even notice because it was under the surface. If by this point I have failed to convince you that the early 2010s are their own, like, aesthetic era or decade, I should just go out behind the barn and fucking die, huh? Well, but this is the whole point, is decades aren't real because the calendar says so. They're real because the world changes in, like, chunks, and then culture turns those changes into a look, a sound, a vibe, the aesthetic of the early 2010s. That's why the whole idea that decades don't have an aesthetic anymore just makes no sense. You can feel the aesthetic of the early 2010s in the skinny jeans and the neon colors and the politics and the economy, and the same thing can be said for the late 2010s, period 2016 to about 2021, 2022, and the 2020s, which start in about 2022 or 2023 and go until the present. Those periods both also have extremely distinct vibes. COVID is kind of a tough one to place. I like to put it in the late 2010s, but you could also make the argument it goes into the 2020s. It's really both. Decades have not gone anywhere. They've just changed. Sure, there's no Friends anymore, there's no Cheers anymore, but that doesn't mean that there's no decade anymore. It's just hard to see a decade while you're living through it, unless you know what to look for. We're now in the year 2016 at the beginning of the next video, so bye.